afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the 8th installment of this Grants 101 webinar series. My name is Claire Chan, Senior Research Analyst here at GMA. Just here to do a short introduction before I turn it over to the grant experts. This is the 8th session, and we have 2 more this year to go, and then this will continue into the new year, into February 2024. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to your grant experts, Amanda Day and Kimberly Hayes-Demuga of Heyday Services. Take it away.
Well, thank you for that, Claire, and welcome everybody. I can't believe we don't have just a huge turnout to talk budgets. Isn't that what everybody lives for?
So exciting.
So exciting. Oh, but yes, that is why we are here today. If you'll give me 1 second to get everything set up on my end. Okay, so yeah, we are talking about grant budgets. And even though, with grant writing, a lot of folks think that it is all writing, but I'm here to tell you that yes, you do have to do a little math and figure out some numbers, but really your budget can help tell that story that you're telling throughout your grant application. So budget certainly is a very important aspect of it. And I will tell you, Kimberly and I both, I believe, do this as well. The budget is probably one of the first things I work on when I put together a grant proposal, because it really does affect so many other aspects, right? Knowing how much money you're going to ask for, that's going to determine potentially how much staff you're adding, how much equipment you're buying, which then affects potentially how many people you're serving, or how large your project is, how small it is, how in depth, how many things you're doing, so if we're putting something together and it's only $20,000, that's going to look very different when it comes to my goals and objectives and things like that than if I've got maybe a $2 million proposal. That certainly is going to affect a lot of things. So a good way to work on your grant is to consider starting with your grant budget. And we're going to just kind of walk you through getting one put together and what you can do and can't do and all that good stuff. For those of you who have joined us for other webinars, hi, hello, same slide. You've seen this now 8 times. But if you're new to this, just a quick background about Kimberly and I. Together, we have over 50 years of grant experience, have been doing a lot of training and a lot of grant writing, and we've built 1 or 2 or 12,000 budgets in our day, I'd say. So
safe and accurate. Not
yes. Yeah. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kimberly to start talking about the different aspects of grant budgets.
I was very resistant to this when I first got started, because I came to grant writing as someone who had good writing skills, like good business communication and writing skills. And that's how I got into grant writing. But it didn't take too long before I realized that the budget is just another way to tell the story of the program or project that you're seeking funding for. And I want to get into the 3 components of basic budget. And again, as always, this is an overview. Your mileage may vary, and please always go by what the grant funding agency has included in its instructions, including budgets and other things, right? We're giving you an overview of the most common things, but the good news, bad news of this is that styles of budget formats can vary, and definitions of terms can vary from grant to grant, sometimes even in the same agency. So we want to get you an overview so that you're familiar with the kinds of things that you might see, or maybe that you have seen in the past. The final thing I would add is, here I am telling y'all, oh yes, I came to grant writing as a writer. But as a grant reviewer, I just finished a series of, 41 grants from a Department of Health in Indiana that had asked us, that separately had asked Amanda and asked me to be grant reviewers. Guess where I went first when I opened up any application? Here's a hint, it rhymes with budget. Went to the budget first. As a writer, you would think, and as a grant, I would go right to the tell me all about your program. No, I went to the budget first, because that can give that right away. I was like, okay, so you're providing medical care to primary care. This is what you're looking for. This is how much it costs. Or I could look at that and go, what? So we're gonna just break it down for you.
Well,
next hour.
And if I can, Kimberly, I will say, while I did not go to the budget first, what I found interesting is that a lot of folks didn't understand the difference between their organizational budget and their grant budget. So I'm sure you're going to walk them through that, but just it's amazing how many people don't understand the difference, which, hello, I didn't understand that when I first started either. So that's why we're here.
I mean, and you could be being asked for budgets, and it's like, is it the entire city budget? Is it the department's budget? Or is it the project budget? Again, a lot of that will be spelled out in your RFP, or sometimes it's called a NOFO or an OFA. All it is are initials signifying the grant instruction guide, right? And for state and federal grants, those are usually highly detailed and usually will run anywhere between 40 to 100 pages worth of good stuff, including budget. So for the purposes of this webinar today, when we're talking about budget, we are not talking about your overall organization or departmental budget, right? We're talking about the program or project or perhaps thing as an equipment that you are using this grant application to hopefully to fund. So I'm gonna break it down for you when we're talking about program, generally speaking, in state and federal grants, it's maybe a larger scale, including staff, including all sorts of equipment and supplies, usually a longer term thing. Perhaps it's a program that you already have in place that you are expanding, you're augmenting, you're adding staff, equipment, training, whatever it is. That's a way to look at a program budget. Sometimes these two words are used interchangeably. These two words are program and project. But generally, a project is going to be not necessarily a smaller thing, but like a thing with a clear beginning and end. But it could be a huge construction project, a huge water and sanitation project, stormwater drain, whatever it might be. A project that's more of a, we're doing this starting here, it ends here, and then it's done for a little while, maybe other than maintenance or something like that. The program budget is obviously going to be pretty complex, lots of moving parts, and we have some simplified examples of what that's going to look like. I'm also curious, maybe Amanda, folks can put in the chat what kind of experience they have with budgets. What do you think would make sense? We could ask them, how do you regularly work with budgets? In just the jobs that you do every day, or is this something new to you? So you could put in the chat new or regular. So LaShandra says new. Okay, we are going to walk you through here. So anyone else now? She can't be the only person that's on this.
There we go.
Here they come. I know there's always that lag, and I'm like, oh, did everybody decide to eat lunch or leave the building? So new, regular, very involved, new. So the folks who are very involved, if you, as we go through this, if you have some tips and tricks that you want to add in, you just drop those in the chat. And if you're new and you have a specific question versus a comment or a tip or some advice, put that in the Q&A. So again, program, sort of more complex, lots of moving parts. Project could be a big thing, but is maybe more finite, right? And then equipment, typically the simplest budget. I know that Amanda has had lots of experience with the federal assistance to firefighters grant, where it's like, what is it that you need? How old are the things that you have? What are you going to do with it? And it's very straightforward. So that's great. But for a lot, and it's super helpful, but for a lot of the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Recovery Act funding, the programs and projects are just more complex by definition. So we wanted to establish some sort of ground rules here. And Amanda, when you get a chance, we'll just go on to the next slide where it's just sort of talking about some common cost elements. So again, I'm going to move the chat out of the way just for a moment so I can see everything here. usually, and this was a big learning curve for me when I first got started. Your municipality is going to create a budget. People are probably going to have lots of opinions, thoughts, and feelings about that budget. There will be voting, there will be discussion. In the end, you have a budget set up by city staff and team members, your finance team, or whoever it is that is doing that in your municipality, right? With categories that y'all have agreed on or agreed to disagree, it's all there. Looking at budgets for grant applications for newbies, you're going to find they're going to tell you the elements that are in the budget for the program, project, or equipment. They're going to tell you that because it's going to be, and usually for federal grant, depending on the agency, once you're registered and in the portal, they will say, use this form. I mean, there are different forms, Amanda, maybe if you want to put some of the abbreviations for them in the chat, but it's a budget form that you'll be using for your grant application. They may also ask for your municipality's overall budget or the overall budget of the department in which the program or the project or the equipment is taking place, right? That's why you need to be the subject matter expert and read all that stuff that's in the RFP or NOFO. So, and Amanda's making a good point in the chat. Usually they say, you can use our form or create something similar. I am on team use the form that they provide. I don't want to leave anything out. It does mean more work, and for that, I am sorry. You will have to take items from an existing budget and plug them in. Those typical items might include things like staffing. It may be a single line item just for staffing. Usually it isn't. It's usually salaries and payroll taxes and fringe benefits, and those may be broken out by benefit. If you are applying for coverage for that staffing, you'll want to make sure you get all of that. But even if you're not, even if in the actual grant request, you're seeking equipment only maybe, or materials and supplies only, if you're putting together a budget about the entire program or project, you'll always want to make sure you have these elements, even if you're not asking them for them from the funder. This is what we saw when we were reviewing those grants for that Indiana Department of Health. A lot of grant recipients didn't really get that distinction. They just, if they were asking for, I'm just going to make up a number, if they were asking for $100,000, they were only putting in maybe equipment or travel to training, but they weren't including the staff needed and the cost. So you couldn't really get an idea of the entire program or project. And I hope that makes sense. It's an important distinction, and I can see why it's confusing. What you want is for the reviewer to understand that you realize that if you are asking for extra cruisers, or if you're asking for a mobile mammogram unit, or if you are asking for a project related to Parks and Rec, you know that there are going to be people involved, and you already have that covered. Either it's in your budget and you can say where it's covered, so that you're not giving the impression that this is sort of a half-formed program. So typical categories, as I said, the equipment, supplies. The difference between equipment and supplies is generally cost. And for federal grants and for state grants that are passed through for federal funding, they're going to tell you what those categories are. Here's the deal. Your municipality can have lower requirements, right? Because the federal requirements, they may say something, oh, you don't have to, we're getting into procurement here, but they may say, well, for federal, and the federal guidelines may be, gosh, man, what is it, like $10,000 or less? Maybe for your municipality, it may be something really different. You can always be stricter than federal guidelines, whether it's procurement or budgeting. You just can't be more open, and you just need to be consistent. As a general rule, equipment is generally going to be less than 5,000. And I mean 5,000 plus. I got it backwards. I'm so sorry. 5,000 plus, and then supplies typically less than 5,000. If you've been doing this for a while, you may remember that back in the day, desktop computers and workstations were considered equipment. Now they're considered supplies. Certainly you can spend a lot of money on laptops or workstations, but the shelf life of the item and the price drop has put them more into the supply category. Other typical parts of cost elements in a budget could be travel. If you are working with community health navigators who may travel from place to place, or if you're doing a series of wellness checks through the sheriff's department related to access to healthcare for older adults, for example, including travel costs, or if you need to send folks to any sort of training or certification, travel costs would be a common element. And besides staffing, you may be contracting with an engineering firm, an architectural firm, evaluation consortium. That would fall under contract versus staffing, right? Because even though they're people, they're not people who are on your staff. You're just working with them temporarily. Construction costs, particularly for a lot of these BIL grants that we've talked about in previous webinars. There's usually an other category or one or more. And I would recommend trying as much as you can when you're transferring, because chances are you'll need to, remember, because their categories may be a little different than how you're set up. I would try as much as possible to put as much as you can into each of those categories and keep notes as to what you either condensed or expanded from your existing budget, right, into the budget format that the funder wants. Because you're going to want that later on when you're trying to figure out which costs go where. And most of these larger scale grants will also allow the grantee or the potential grantee to include a line item of indirect costs. And Amanda's going to give you more details about that a little bit later on. So next up is I would say an overview budget. I would say kind of a simplified budget, because also a regular budget for a grant, it would be super tiny. And I never want to be one of those presenters who pops up a slide and says, hey, I know this is a little hard to read. No, we want to keep it simple, walk through some categories, and know that your mileage is going to vary on the exact format, but the categories and the concepts are what we want to get across here. So you'll see, we talked about a personnel line item, and underneath it, you might have new staff. And by new staff, it's staff that are going to be hired for this program or project. Not so much necessarily for the equipment grant, but definitely for programs and projects. Maybe you need to bring on new staff to expand services or provide additional oversight. You may be taking parts of the time of existing staff to carry out this program. Then you're going to want to do things like think about what percentage or what part of one FTE of their time, which FTE is full-time employee, would go in that line item. We'll also talk in a few minutes about volunteers, how that could be a way to add into your budget, even though you're not paying for the volunteers, that if they are providing a specific service or the program that you would otherwise have to pay for, there is monetary value to what they're doing. And if you look to the far right of your example here, you'll see an in-kind category. That may be where that would be going. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. We mentioned contract labor. Agencies that you're contracting with that are providing specific services for temporary time, right? You're not hiring them, but you're working with them maybe for the duration of the spring. When you move down to Roman numeral 2 under direct costs, and again, there are direct costs and indirect costs. Amanda's going to handle indirect costs later. You'll see that at the bottom of this simplified budget. But direct costs are things that must happen that have costs attached to them to make this program or project work. And again, there could be equipment involved. There's, if we had room on this, there could be equipment, supplies, training, travel. If there are any kind of extra kinds of technology, if there's like rewiring or extra broadband or something like that, could be a thing, is something essential to this program versus something a little bit more behind the scenes, which would make it indirect costs. So I want to direct your attention to the columns. And again, super simplified, right? But you've got a total here. You can see the first column is total. You've got subtotals on the line item column that would also appear in that totals column. The funding request here, what I'm saying is there will probably be a place on the budget for you to say, here's the money we want from you, agency to which we're applying. Here's how it's distributed. Maybe you're asking for $1 million and 200,000 is going to be divided between new and existing staff. And the balance might appear in equipment, training, travel, and technology. That's how you divide up the request, right? By the area for which you're seeking funding, so that it's not one lump amount, so that the reviewer can understand where things are going. For example, and we'll get into more detail on this in a minute, but if you had like $1 million request and it was all to hire one new person, you know, not the good look that you would want for grant review for reasons that I'll explain in just a few minutes, but spreading out and explaining where the money's going to go is super helpful. Then there's usually another column, other funders or something like it, and the other funders could actually be your municipality. If there are existing staff that will have part of their salary covered in this funding request, right? Where's the other part of their salary coming from? Chances are it's either budgeted in your like operations budget or funded through another grant. So that's where you would sort of divvy out that in a column that's going to look something like that. And then in kind, again, is where you're going to provide the monetary value, and we'll talk about how to establish that, of items or donated time that you would otherwise have to pay for, you know, in cash, but you're getting it donated somehow, and it's something directly related to the program or project or equipment for which you're seeking funding. So it's looking pretty quiet in the chat, and I don't see any Q&A. I'm wondering, Amanda, is there anything that you think we should emphasize before we kind of cruise into the next explanation of?
Yeah, I would just say, so when I worked in local government, you know, budget, even though I'm the grant person, I'm ultimately responsible for putting that grant application together. I lean heavily on my program and project people. So if I was writing a grant for the fire department, I was probably working with a firefighter, right? If I was doing a road project, I'm probably working with somebody from my engineering or public works department. And I lean heavily on them to tell me what belongs in the budget. Now, I'm not trusting them to say, oh, it belongs here, but I'm talking to them about, okay, if we're going to do this thing, what's it going to cost? And if it's a construction project, we're looking at, you know, how much is it going to be to design this? And are we designing it in-house, or are we going to end up going out and hiring somebody to do that? And so if we're going to, is that going to cost us, you know, we're probably going to have to advertise, right, to find the consultant we're going to hire. And so it's going to cost us money to do that. And often you can put those expenses in a grant. So I'm talking with them, walking through that. And sometimes, you know, you might be doing a project where they're like, oh, it's not, I just need to hire somebody. That's it. One position, not a whole lot of money. Here we go. Great. But then, you know, I would always ask the question of, okay, but are they going to need a computer? Well, yeah, they will. Do they have one? Do you already have one for them? Or do we need to buy one? Oh, well, yeah, we're going to need to buy them one. Well, guess what? If the grant will let us pay for that, I want to put that. Are they going to need a phone? And are they going to need, you know, the monthly expense for that? Are they going to need some supplies? You know, they may be printing things. They, you know, what are they going to need? Travel if part of their job entails them having to go. So, you know, let your people you're working with on the grant, whoever is like, hey, we need grant money for this, let them guide that. But then you need to come in and start asking those questions, because it can be very easy for them to just think, I just need to hire a person. Okay, great. But that person probably needs more things than just a salary and benefits. And if you're sitting here going, oh my gosh, I don't know how much money and what are our benefits? Someone in your city, I don't care how small you are, somebody there is in charge of HR, whether it's the city clerk or whether you have an HR department. They can tell you, you know, like if I was writing a grant to hire 7 new police officers, I didn't have to guess how much we paid them or what the fringe benefits were. I could just go to HR and say, hey, we're going to need to hire 7 new entry-level police officers. And they could create that. Here's their salary. Here's what their fringe benefit package. They could break it down for me. This is how much health insurance. This is how much FICA costs. This is the payroll taxes. So I'm not having to create that sort of thing. So before you're like, how do I figure these things out? You're probably not having to figure out as much as you think. You're probably doing more facilitating, asking questions, and I would push back on folks. I'm like, hey, we need this. Well, how much does that cost? I don't know. Well, you probably know what vendors to call and get some price quotes from, because I could figure that out, but the learning curve is going to be a little quicker than who you work with on a regular basis. So don't be afraid to make budget. That's going to be a group project. And you could also involve finance staff. They're real good at budgets. So it doesn't hurt to bring them in.
It should be a group project.
You
Even
really
if the
should.
group is just the two of you, even if that is your staff, it should be a group project so that you capture the costs. And I hope this is a great illustration of why it might be good to start with the budget. Even if you're like, I'm not a budgeteer, I'm a writer. It's like, no, if you're bringing people in, once you start wanting to put dollar amounts next to things, it gets serious really fast in that good way, so that you can get the information that you need. So you're not leaving something out. And it could be a way for folks to think through a process that doesn't involve lots of writing, because not everybody is comfortable with writing, but most people are going to be pretty clear on what things cost and what we need and how much it costs. So
Yep.
I would say that's a good reason for starting there. And in
Yep.
the interest of time, we're about at our halfway mark. We're going to roll on to costs. Remember my little joke about if you have $1 million budget and you're just hiring one person, that's not probably going to fly for a lot of reasons, but also it may not be a reasonable cost. If you look at our little acronym here, it's ARN, which kind of sounds like a pirate. ARN, it's a pirate's budget, right? So your costs need to be allowable. And that means allowable by the rules that are established in the grant and by legislation. So you want to read that list. And really, most federal and state proposals that I have seen, and I have seen my fair share, and so has Amanda, they will tell you what is allowable and what isn't. Usually food, not an allowable cost. Have a nice day. It's because people abused it in the past, and that's why we can't have nice things. So no food. You can't ask for that. If you put it in your budget, you better be showing that someone else is paying for it other than the federal government.
Yeah. And like some grants will pay for staffing, other grants will not.
Yeah.
So it depends from funder to funder what they allow.
So whether or not the cost is allowable, and then whether or not it's allocable, which means was the cost incurred for, or will it be incurred, excuse me, for this particular program or project. So what we're saying here, the difference between the two, allowable and allocable: one, does the grant allow you to even ask for these specific line items? And two, are the line items that you ask for going to be directly related to the grant? Can you allocate them to this in a way that can be proven? Because as in a quick step back, I would remind you, and most of you already know this, most state and federal grants are reimbursement versus here's a check, have a nice day, spend all the money, send us a report. That would be great, but that is usually not how it works. It's usually monthly or quarterly, depending on the grant, depending on your needs. You would do the work first and then pay for it and then get reimbursed for it. So just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page about that. So getting back to our Pirates budget cost, a little acronym here, right? Allowable, allocable, reasonable. $1 million for one person to do something in a municipality, probably not reasonable. It's not going to be consistent with the market rates. Like if you were hiring a doctor for a new clinic, they may want $1 million, but they're not going to get $1 million from this grant, nor should you be, because it's really not in keeping with sort of the market rates in your area. And is it necessary? Does this cost help move the program forward toward the goals and objectives that you set? And we covered goals and objectives recently, she said, trying to remember which one it was. But if you go back into the archived recordings, you'll find that we talked about that. So ARN, the Pirate's Guide to costs, to think about the costs and how they're going to be included in the budget. You don't have to make the pirate noise, right, when you're talking about this, but if it just helps you remember, and it helps, more importantly, it helps the people you're working with remember how these things are going to have to be. So hoping that's a good guideline to help you complete that budget. Again, should not be a solo sport
Yeah.
unless you are the only employee in your municipality. And still, there are going to be councils members and other folks who would have some sort of input in this. You just really bringing up the budget first may be the way to make sure you've got the buy-in, to make sure that your program and finance folks are really involved. Because usually what happens is the finance folks, as Amanda said, are going to come in with the, did you think about this or that? And these sort of background costs, like, you know, supplies and training and travel. And the program people are going to be able to say, we need this piece of equipment because of X, and they're going to be the subject matter experts. So bringing them together, a lot of times the grant developer, the grant writer is going to be in there sort of facilitating the gathering of this information to make sure that everything is represented and you have a true picture of the costs, and also that people have a true idea of how grants work and what this grant will pay for.
Yep. Well, and I would say on this list here, the necessary part is something you sometimes have to push back, because I can give a perfect example of this. I was working on a grant with the police department where we were doing a bicycle safety education program. We had applied for the grant the year before for about, I'd say $18,000 we had asked for, and we'd gotten the grant. And we were in the middle of implementing it. This was through the Governor's Office of Highway Safety. They loved our program so much that before the next round came out, they called me up and said, hey, we love your program. We highly encourage you to apply again this next round. Okay. So this is good news. Rarely do I have a funder say, hey, we love your project so much, apply again, but they did. So I go to our 2 bicycle safety officers. I tell them the good news. They were like, great, we have some ideas for expanding what we're doing. Do you think that's possible? I'm like, absolutely. Y'all think about what you want to do. I'll wait for the guidelines to come out and then we'll meet. Well, when we met, not only were the bike safety officers there, but so was the police chief and about 5 other officers, because they had all heard the good news that we were invited to apply again. And suddenly they're handing me a $250,000 grant budget, because that was the max you could ask for. And like 2 of the items on there was an SUV on there. And I'm like, okay, but why do we need an SUV for a bicycle safety program when we're mostly out in the community and everybody already has cars? It's not necessary, right? But oftentimes your people, when they're like, but we're allowed to ask for up to, because, you know, most grants will have that limit. We can ask for $1 million. Yes, we can. But if the things on there aren't necessary, needless to say, we ended up submitting that $250,000 budget because the chief said, this is what I need you to do. And I couldn't change his mind. So we did. I expected us to get a denial. Instead, Governor's Office of Highway Safety came back and said, hey, we really do love your project, but we're only giving you $20,000. So you cut your budget and make it work. So we were fortunate they still funded us, but it ended up all that extra work I did to try to explain and write goals and objectives related to all this stuff was a waste of my time, because again, none of that stuff was necessary related to the program we were actually implementing, right? So I just tell that story to say, a lot of times people get dollar signs. You don't have to ask for the max. You can if it's necessary, but
you gotta be able to prove it. You have to prove the need. And the need isn't that we want something bright, shiny, and new.
Yep. True story. So, okay. So let's talk about match versus cost share. Most funders use these terms interchangeably. And what this is basically in a nutshell is a lot of funders will say, hey, yes, we'll give you money for your project, but we're not paying 100% of the costs. They may tell you this is an 80-20 grant, meaning they'll pay 80% of the total cost up to a certain dollar amount, right? But then the remaining 20% has to come from other funding. And whether that's from your agency or whether you have other partners who are helping you, but you've got to come up with another non-federal source of funding That's what that match is for. Okay. And you can see here, there's a lovely definition from Department of Health and Human Services. Okay. Cost sharing, when it may be used differently than match, is a negotiated amount that may or may not be adjusted after the fact, right? So it's not necessarily based on the total amount. It could just be, hey, you're going to have to pay for this much. You're sharing, $10,000 of this total cost, kind of a thing. But
that's something that is predetermined, right, Amanda?
yes, yep. Predetermined. You'll know that in the guidelines because they tell you. And that's important to know because you may have, say it's $1 million project and you're like, great, but that means we have to come up with $200,000. And if your organization doesn't have $200,000 available and ready, you really should not be applying for that grant, because most funders want to know, like when you're signing that application, you're saying, yes, we have the match and we're ready to spend it. So it can't be, well, we hope next year our taxes come in the way we hope they do. You need to know that you've got that money in hand ready to go. And a good way to do that is if you can have some set aside funding. So when I worked for the city of Alpharetta, every year we had it was in our capital budget, but we had a grant matching fund that we would put money in there so that when I was writing a grant, let's just say we had $300,000 in that matching fund. If I'm applying for a grant and we needed $100,000, I can say I have it because it's there and we could earmark it for that grant. So if the grant got awarded, great, we've got the money, we move it into the grant account and we spend it. If the grant gets denied, then we can be like, okay, well, it's still sitting in that pot for the next grant I'm going to apply for. And that makes it super easy, but I know not everybody can just throw a couple $100,000 in a grant pot. So you may have to do some planning ahead to figure out, okay, next year we know we're going for a couple of big grants. We need to budget for this match somewhere. Okay.
And this may be a moment of education because most people, if you're not involved in grants, you may not even understand how this works. So you may be working for someone or reporting to someone who is pushing for those big grants and has limited knowledge that matches are in place and that the grant is reimbursement only. So I feel like those, in my experience, have been the two sticking points, whether it's local government, municipalities seeking funding or nonprofit seeking funding. Explaining that concept, and it's non-negotiable. If you don't have the money and you can't afford to do the work up front and get reimbursed for it, then you shouldn't apply for the grant. So just putting that out there.
Yep. So when you're dealing with federal grants, there are some rules regarding your match dollars. You can't just tell them, yep, we've got $200,000, it's your match, and they're just going to trust you. Okay. You do have to verify. So you have to show how you spent that money towards the grant stuff. So you're going to have invoices and receipts and checks. Also, your match you can only use once. I don't get to say, hey, I'm using this grant for a trail, and here's my $100,000 match where I bought construction supplies to build this trail. You don't also get to later apply for another grant that needs a match of $100,000 and go, oh, I bought these supplies. That counts as the match here. So once you've said, this is my match for this grant, that money's been spent. You can't count it on another grant. Again, it just like all your grant money, everything needs to be necessary for your program. It needs to be allowable. Okay. So if you've got a grant you're applying for that does not allow staffing, like they won't pay for staffing, you can't then pay for staffing and count that as your match. Okay. So it needs to be something that's allowable expense with that activity. You cannot use other federal grants to match federal grants. Now there's one or two exceptions swirling around out there. So don't go, but I have this one time. Okay. It may have happened once, but as a general rule, federal grants can't match other federal grants. Local grants could. If you got a grant, say you're Union City, say you got a grant from Fulton County and it was strictly Fulton County tax dollars, that could be a match for a federal grant because if it's not a federal grant program, right? It needs to be in your budget. We mentioned the other day, we had talked about 2 CFR Part 200. That rules the land when it comes to federal dollars. And in that guidebook, section 200.306, that section specifically talks about match requirements. And when Kimberly starts teaching again, I'll find the link again to 2 CFR and put that in there for those of you who may not have seen that the other day. And your match, your grant period is a special magical window of time. So you'll have your grant start date and your end date. everything you do has to happen within that window, including your match money. You don't get to go, well, 5 years ago, we designed this project and we spent $300,000 designing it. So it's going to be the match now to construct that project we designed 5 years ago. They're going to tell you that's cute, but no, that doesn't count as your match because it happened so long ago. It's got to be within that window. There are a couple of exceptions. I've seen a few grants that will give you a little bit of a leeway, but not very often. So, and again, you usually have to have that match money ready when you apply for the grant. You don't get to hope and pray that the money falls in your lap. Okay. So
I mentioned earlier in kind, and Amanda is going to kindly put the link to the CFR we just discussed. I know we put it in the last one, and y'all were up for some serious in-depth reading, so it's coming at you again. We've talked a little bit about in kind, and in the interest of time, I wanted to again say in kind could be included in your match. Not all matching funds or your match total dollar amount has to be cash. The reason I am using my hands and has to be in maybes is because it varies from application to application. And if you are large and in charge of the grant process in your municipality, I go there first. First, I look at the deadline, then I go to the money, and then I go to see what do we have to put on what's the skin on the table, and could it be in kind? So again, it's services, items, equipment, could be volunteer labor that at a fair market value is given toward the project. In kind is typically more prevalent in the nonprofit arena. However, match from a municipality could also include staff time that is not being covered by the grant request, but yet they are a part of the project. Does that make sense? Like if somebody was coming in, they're going to spend a quarter of their time on this new project, then that could be the part of the municipality's match, but only if it is something that is allowable and described as such in the proposal itself. So if you want to, on the next slide, there's some examples that are going to look a lot like the typical budget line items we discussed. What I want to call your attention to is if you are able to document volunteer time, say it's a Parks and Rec program, and you have community volunteers that come in and maintain a park or a trail. That's just part of what they do. Maybe it's a Kiwanis Club or a local service organization or a company. It doesn't, whoever it is, you can document that time and you can calculate the value of volunteer time. And we have a link here. A great source for this by state is Independent Sector. And we've mentioned them before, where you can go in by state and look at the value of what I would call unskilled volunteer time. And by that, I mean, maybe you have an accounting firm or a legal firm that donates their time to maintain that trail. They're doing it for employee morale. They're doing it for good community service. So they're not donating their time as legal experts or accounting experts. They're performing a volunteer function. And if you didn't have volunteers to maintain that trail, then you'd have to pay somebody or hire or contract to have it done. If you go to Independent Sector, you can find the value per hour, and you can use that to track either the hours that people, if it's an ongoing program, I'm going back to the trail, for example, you may already have volunteer logs, and you can use that to figure out the value or the projected value in the upcoming grant cycle. It's probably more than you think. I want to say, I should have checked Georgia before we got on there. It may be as high now as like $28 an hour, according to Independent Sector. But Amanda's making the point, and she has an example in, oops, I'm seeing something like a Word document on the screen now.
Oops, sorry.
There you go.
Looking on too many things.
I know, I've got way too many tabs open myself. So sometimes you can use this, like Independent Sector is a known and trusted website. Sometimes they're going to tell you, we value the volunteer. If you want to use volunteer time as a match or as an example of an in-kind contribution, we value this at X dollars an hour in the grant application instructions. So just know that that's there. A final point about this, and again, in the interest of time, is if there are, for example, if you have a community clinic where recently retired doctors are volunteering their time, you're not going to want to just use the independent sector 28 bucks an hour for their time. If they're performing their actual skilled volunteer labor, you want to use Department of Labor. The Georgia Department of Labor can give you some breakdowns on what the hourly equivalent wages would be for skilled volunteers, and you can use that to calculate the value. Other things we've talked about, you know, it could, the in-kind contribution could be a facility. If it's a new program and you are either you or a community partners providing the facility, that could be an example of an in-kind contribution. Vehicles, land, again, for a park or a trail, if it's being donated, just to give you examples of things to think about and how you can incorporate those into the overall budget to show it's a complete program or project. You're having other costs of essential functions covered, and you recognize that so that your reviewer knows that you know what you're doing.
Yeah. And the nice thing about it, if your funder allows in kind, this is part of your match, right? So let's just say you've got this project, you're going to build a trail, and somebody's is willing to donate the land for you. Again, you want to make sure it happens within the right time frame. But if the land is worth $100,000 and your match is $200,000, guess what? You've now got half of your match covered by an in-kind donation. So you've just split the cost in half of the money or the cash you're going to have to bring to the table. So in-kind really can help if you're an organization that is strapped for extra cash. In-kind can potentially really help you when it comes to making sure you meet whatever that, you know, if it's a 20% match requirement, 10%, 50%, depending on what the funders requires.
So in 10 minutes, Amanda will now
Nope.
explain indirect versus
yeah. To explain this best, I'm just going to give an example. So your Parks and Rec department has decided, like, you've built this new great community center and you have a whole bunch of basketball courts, but you don't have a basketball program yet. So you've decided we're going to go after, you know, this recreation grant and we're going to create our basketball program. So to do that, your direct expenses, you're probably going to need a staff member to run the program, right? They're the person that's going to be, you know, handling the registrations, finding the volunteer coaches, figuring out the schedules, getting kids on the right teams. If health checks need to be happening, you're gathering those. Like, so someone's going to be running the program. So that staff member is certainly somebody you could be using the grant to pay their time, because that's a direct expense, because they are directly working on that basketball program, right? You're probably going to need basketballs. You may need to send some of your coaches to training. That could be a cost. So it's basically anything that without that, this program is not going to happen. You've got to directly, and it goes directly to that one program and to nothing else. Okay. Now, even though you've already got this great community center built and you've got the basketballs and the lights and the things, you might use the basketball courts for other things, right? It's like sometimes you set up indoor pickleball and that's happening there, or sometimes summer camp is happening and that's for kids, and sometimes track is happening inside there as you're running. So you can't just say, hey, we built these basketball courts, it's going directly to the basketball program, because that's a community center and there's a lot of other things happening. However, part of the time basketball camp or programs are happening there. And so those indirect costs are things that's still necessary, but you can't tie it directly and only to that one program. So it can be things like your rent, your lights, you know, the janitorial services. So, you know, they clean the gym at the end of the day. Can you say that you're the one who messed it up? No, because there were 8 other programs happening in there in the day. But those are kind of the difference. And most grants, pretty much all of them, they want to know when you build your program budget, what are the direct program costs? Again, the things you absolutely need, because it goes directly to that program. And so I've got it kind of broken down in examples. Again, project staff, travel, training, equipment, supplies, consultants, things like that. It could be a vehicle you need, you know, part of your, you know, I've gotten a grant for, we had a boxing program through our police athletic league, and we were able to buy a small bus because they were having to travel so far for a lot of these different boxing programs. So that was a direct cost. We had to have, that. We also had to have someone to drive the bus. That's a direct cost. Okay. Then indirect costs, again, these are, some people like to use the term overhead. That could be another helpful way to think about indirect costs. It's your rent, your utilities, your administrative staff. You've got a program person managing the program. You may have an admin assistant who's helping with registration, but she's also doing a million other things. So, could you track, oh, she's spending 2 hours a week and track her time and tie it directly to the grant? You could, but that could be a heck of a lot of work to have to track all of that. Or you may want to lump that in as indirect, right? Your auditing services, legal services, again, all the things that are necessary to run your agency as a whole are indirect costs, okay? But it's not always as clear what's direct versus what's indirect, right? And so again, the admin assistant is a great example. That person could go either place. So you need to make a decision and you need to account for it in the right way because you're not going to put it both places, right? And when it comes to federal funding, we could spend 3 hours talking about indirect cost rate and how it works. I'm just going to say this about it. You can either establish your indirect cost rate. Okay. So you'd work with your federal funder and figure out what is your percentage of your indirect cost rate. Is it 10%? Is it 18%? Is it 30.1%? I will tell you, as a local government, it's probably going to be lower. It's probably going to be in the 8 to 12, 13% chances are. Or rather than establishing a rate, the federal government allows you to claim what they call the de minimis rate, which is 10%. So if you are working on a grant and your agency does not have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you are allowed to just claim 10% on that. Okay. And again, it's not always 10% of the whole budget. This is where it gets really complicated. So like I said, I think we've got a resource related to indirect cost rates to help if that's something you want more information on. But just know that, think about direct costs. You have to have it specifically for your grant program to be successful. And then all the other things that are used to make your agency run as a whole are going to be indirect. That's kind of an easy way to look at the difference between the two.
So super quick, I wanted to go through some of the most common budget mistakes. And these are mistakes that I myself made, and in fact, very recently. So not including necessary costs. This wasn't a grant budget, but it was a contract. We were podcasting for a grants conference, and I did not include transportation costs from the airport to the venue, but I included everything else, mostly. The big things were all covered. My point is, because I didn't include it and we signed that contract, have a nice day. Ubering is on us today. So that's a small and maybe kind of funny example, but if you don't include those costs, if you're not thinking it through, and that includes not building out the entire project budget, right? Or program budget, only thinking of the grant amount and doing, that's a super common mistake that we also saw when we were reviewing for the health department. If you don't have the match in hand, and by in hand, I mean an account where you can say, behold, here it is, don't do it unless you, I can't even think of an example now, but if they ask for a match, you need to have the match. If the budget doesn't match your written program description, that's where the writing and the numbers come in. That's where one of the first things I said was budgets are another way to tell your story. If your budget has a bus in it or a cargo van that is not mentioned at all in your program description, that's a red flag to a reviewer that you're not fully cognizant of everything that your program needs, or you just made a mistake. And finally, unless directed otherwise, and I can't think of an example for a municipality or a county where they can just ask for general operating funds. I can't come up with one. I'm sure there's somebody's going to write in one day and educate me. But until then, your organization budget and your project budget are not the same. And I feel like those are the most common budget mistakes that I've come across. Either I've made them myself or I've come across them as reviewing grants. And finally, as we close, as always, Amanda and I host a podcast, Fundraising Heyday. We have 3 episodes. If you can't get enough of this budget stuff, we got podcast episodes about this. And we also have a resource guide that Claire and GMA is going to make sure that you get. And it includes links to federal agencies that give detailed budget instruction by agencies such as Department of Justice. I think we have EPA, we might have HHS and a couple of others. As always, this is where you can find us. And we want to thank you for joining us today. And we want to thank GMA for this opportunity to share this information with you so that you can get those grants.
Wonderful. Well, the pleasure is truly ours, Amanda and Kimberly. Thank you for another great session breaking down kind of the ins and outs of developing a grant budget. This is definitely, especially when it comes to talking about local match and meeting your local match, that's a big pain point for, I think, a lot of cities, as you know, when it comes to applying for grants. It can be the one thing that prevents a city from being able to pursue a grant. So again, you've shared a lot of great information, and I've dropped a link in the chat, the second link to where you can access materials from this webinar, as well as all the past 7 webinars that we've held so far. Our next webinar will be November 30th on top 5 reasons grant requests are declined. So that will be another great topic. And I hope you will all register and to see you all at that event. Again, thank you so much, Amanda and Kimberly. Thank you to everyone on this call for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you next time.